Great, thank you very much. My name is Sandy Doran, and I am the policy expert at NEVI with a focus on an initiative that you might recognize by its acronym SARA, so the State Authorization and Reciprocity Agreement. But I'm not here to talk about SARA today. I am here to introduce the facilitator of our next program, Dr. Phil DeSalvio. Phil, thank you. Phil is the founding dean of the College of Advancing and Professional Studies at UMass Boston. Phil's a regular contributor to the New England Journal of Higher Education, our flagship publication, specifically focused on a series called New Directions for Higher Education. And if you haven't read this series, I would encourage you to go to the NEVI website. It's a series of questions and answers on very important policy issues of the day. Phil has authored a number of very interesting articles on change and transformation in higher education today. Specifically, staying above water, change is critical to institutional competitiveness in the modern era. So Phil is well versed with the topics that we're talking about here today. Dean DeSalvio earned his EDD from the Harvard Graduate School of Education and did his postdoc fellowship at Johns Hopkins. So without further ado, Phil is going to introduce the remaining panelists for this morning's panel. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Phil DeSalvio.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. We also have a distinguished group of speakers here in this group, and we welcome you to how employable are New England college graduates, and in this particular session, the future of experiential and work-integrated learning. I'd like to introduce our speakers and perhaps have them speak a bit about some of their background and what they do. I introduce you to Peter Stokes. Peter is the managing director at Huron and the author of the fast-selling book, Higher Education and Employability, New Models for Integrating Study and Work. Lynn Pasquarella, president of the American Association of Colleges and Universities, and Paul Stoney, CEO of the World Association for Cooperative and Work-Integrated Education. It's a pleasure to have a conversation with you this morning. Peter, would you like to say a few words about yourself?
Sure, just to give you a little bit more perspective on my background and the orientation from which I'll be speaking. I work with a large management consulting firm that works with hundreds of colleges and universities all across the United States. Prior to joining Huron, I worked in the president's office at Northeastern University, where I focused on global strategy and business development. Prior to that, I spent over a decade with a Boston area higher education research firm called EduVentures. And going back a little bit further, once upon a time, I was a teacher in the classroom, and I taught in the English department at Tufts University.
Lynn Pasquarella, as you've heard, the president of the Association of American Colleges and Universities. I started my college career at Quinebaug Valley Community College, transferred to Mount Holyoke College, and then did my PhD in philosophy at Brown University. When I graduated from Brown, that trajectory really engendered in me a deep and abiding commitment to the centrality of liberal education, to access to excellence regardless of socioeconomic background, and to the notion of colleges and universities as civic missions. And I was very privileged to have a 23-year career at the University of Rhode Island that lived those values every single day. I was a faculty member at philosophy, became the dean of the graduate school, and the vice provost for research, and the vice provost for academic affairs, and then became the provost at the University of Hartford for 2 years before returning to Mount Holyoke, my alma mater, to become its 18th president. And I just started my new position on July 1st. I'm thrilled to be in DC.
Paul?
Thank you, and good morning. There may be a slight confusion between Phil and myself because we realized that the bios and the pictures on the website, the pictures were a little bit old at the time. I had to be it, and Phil didn't. So, it's terrific to be here. We were hosted by Michael and Debbie about a year ago. We had a provost colloquium on experiential education. inviting provosts from throughout New England to learn a little bit more about experiential ed. Some of you may know, I saw recently there's another conference going on in Boston today. It's called the Forbes Under 30 Summit. And I was invited to be a speaker, but when I saw how old I was, they said I perhaps should come to this conference instead. But it's a very large group of people under 30 here in Boston. I began my work as a dean in the College of Business Administration at the University of Denver, and I served there for 10 years. And moved on to Cambridge, Massachusetts as the academic vice president and served there for 10 years as well. I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Jack Curry, the president of Northeastern University, and he hired me as president of what was then called the National Commission for Cooperative Education, which was an organization that promotes cooperative education, specifically that model throughout the United States. Served in that position for 10 years, so you can see there's a little bit of a theme here. I seem to be able to make it 10 years, and then something happens. And then I also had the opportunity to work with the former president of Northeastern, Dr. Richard Freeland, and he was the president of the World Association for Cooperative Education, and he offered me the opportunity to be CEO. And I've broken my record now because I'm beginning my 12th year with that organization, and I'll have a chance in a bit to talk a little bit more about the global work that we do with advancing experiential education. So it's terrific to be here. Thank you.
Very good, Paul. Thank you. The format we'd like to follow this morning is Peter will be saying a few words about his thoughts about several key issues with experiential education. Paul will then respond to some of Peter's issues and points and talk a bit about global work-integrated education. And Lynn will talk about the work that her association is doing, especially in the LEAP area. And then we'll try to facilitate some conversation. I'm sure it'll be vigorous, and then we'll have a Q&A. But no presentation is complete without Aristotle. Would you agree? Experiential learning is not a new concept. Aristotle talks about for the things we have to learn before we can do them, we learn by doing them. So experiential learning is an old form of educating. And I think about what you said about youth, Paul, and I was with the Chamber of Commerce last week, and one of the speakers was talking about demographics. He said that Boston used to be the oldest city on average in the United States. It is now the youngest city on average in the United States. So, riding the T this morning, everyone was on their iPhone, and probably under 30. And so, when we talk about experiential learning and work-integrated learning, it really is a very salient topic for educators today. We thought we might just define experiential learning a bit. I promise not to read from this, but I think there are a few important points that we need to draw from what we mean by experiential learning, and that is learning through reflection on doing. And we see that in many different activities in universities and colleges today. Education abroad and study abroad can be considered experiential learning. Undergraduate research, academic service and learning, internships, cooperative education, vocational education, practicums, field studies, and prior learning, the competency-based learning. In the non-credit-bearing world of experiential learning, we see peer mentoring, we see shadowing, we see leadership development, we see independent learning, life work experiences, co-curricular learning, outdoor education, service learning, volunteering, work study, and it goes on and on. Experiential learning, the theories itself are drawn from Dewey and Lewin and Piaget, developed formally by David Cole, who talks about experiential learning as sort of a four-stage process, one of doing, one of reviewing what you've done, one of conceptualizing the experience, and then actually trying it out. And as we talk about experiential learning, and as our speaker talks about experiential learning, I'm sure they'll draw upon some of these. What is work integrated learning? It has a little bit of a different focus, but in the same family of doing by learning and learning by doing. What Paul has done through his organization has really looked at experiential learning as being utilized by both industry and educational institutions. And the word CWIE, the term that Wace, Paul's organization, refers to as work integrated learning, really looks at true learning as combining classroom, workplace, and classroom learning to be the most effective approach for education. Paul will give you examples of CWIE. We see clinical rotations with physicians and nurses and other healthcare professionals. We see cooperative education. We see community service. Again, internships, practica, semester in industry, undergraduate research, service learning. So both, I think, look towards the experience of doing as an important part of the learning process. So with the establishment of some definitions, and I'm sure our speakers will expand upon that, let me please introduce Peter Stokes. Peter will talk about, I think, some really interesting issues and challenges facing institutions today, and some examples of higher ed institutions looking at the issues in different ways, and then moving forward, how do we move forward? So Peter, I give you the floor.
Thanks, Bill. If I were at the Forbes Under 30 Tech Conference, I probably wouldn't start with this reference, but with this crowd, I'll tell a little anecdote about the 1980s. There's a Cambridge area comedian, some of you may remember, named Stephen Wright, who had the line that experience is the thing you get right after you need it. And so I think what all of us here share is a desire to help people prepare and to be experienced before they need it or right when they need it. And I think many of the folks here in the room are probably supportive of that kind of notion in the right measure, right? This is not an uncontroversial topic of discussion. We don't want to reduce education or knowledge creation to vocation or work product. So we need to think about how to balance these different activities and align them with our values in ways that ultimately produce the kind of outcomes that we want, the personal outcomes, the career outcomes, the economic outcomes. So there's a lot of complicated work to be done as we move down this road, but also, a number of challenges. And what I wanted to highlight here just at the outset is to suggest that there are some complicating factors here that we need to take into consideration when we think about talent development, when we think about the role of experiential learning in supporting talent development, and when we think about the role of higher education in supporting talent development. And the three challenges I wanted to highlight here at the outset are these. First of all of this work is taking place in a very complex ecosystem with many diverse stakeholders, where the ownership and responsibility for assuring work readiness is uncertain. I'll come back and say a little bit more about that. I think one of the other major challenges that really bears a great deal more thinking is that we talk about employability often as though we know what it is. but we don't really have a shared definition of precisely what employability or work readiness really is. So we need to think about that a bit more. And I think perhaps most importantly for the folks in this room, the role of our colleges and universities in operating within and navigating across this ecosystem is changing, and trying to understand what we should be doing differently in order to collaborate and cooperate with the other stakeholders in that ecosystem is a work that remains to be done as well. There are no easy answers. So let me just go back and talk about each of these briefly in a little bit more detail. When we think about this ecosystem and the stakeholders that are in it, certainly we think about university leaders, we think about faculty, we think about students and their parents, we think about alumni, we think about employers, we think about government agencies. We just saw a great representation of what a number of state leaders are attempting to do to foster these kinds of outcomes. Many, many, many different kinds of stakeholders, each with a different kind of stake in the outcome. And when you have that kind of diversity among stakeholders, it can be difficult to coordinate and to create coherence. So we need to think about how we can share the responsibility for producing better outcomes across this diverse body of stakeholders. I also mentioned that it's difficult sometimes to know exactly what we mean by work readiness or employability. And so there are a variety of different sorts of characteristics that we sometimes see associated with those kinds of outcomes. So we hear things like, passion, right? I mean, every corporate values probably has passion in the mix. We hear about empathy. We hear about, increasingly mindfulness over the last decade. Also things like curiosity, self-awareness, reliance, grit is a really big theme these days. But also technical skills, teamwork, collaboration, communication skills, self-management, and also what's called GSD, or getting stuff done, right? Just knowing how to. Sometimes people don't use stuff, but how to get stuff done. So, what's the right balance of all of these skills? Which of these can actually be nurtured through an educational experience? Which of these are perhaps more inherent in the individual, and how we think about our role in fostering those? And then finally, when we think about this environment within which colleges and universities are situated, there have been some interesting studies from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce over the past few years looking at the talent development pipeline. And if you've been reading their studies, one of the things that they argue is that a very simple value chain where you have a prospective learner, an institute that's going to provide the education, and then a diploma at the end, that this kind of simple linear path does not really represent the experience of most individuals in most professions today. And so instead, you may have that prospective student. There will be a myriad of different sorts of educational providers. There will be accredited providers. There will be commercial providers. The employer itself, the employers themselves, may offer additional education and training. And the student will move among all of these different providers, amassing different sorts of credentials along the way, sometimes degrees, sometimes certificates, sometimes non-credit experiences. But at the end of the day, ideally advance through his or her career and realize his or professional aspirations. So we've got lots of different folks out there, boot camps, we've got all kinds of alternative providers. We've got the U.S. Department of Education through its EQUIP program, supporting the collaboration between traditional nonprofit universities and commercial companies providing training and allowing students access to federal funding through those collaborations. But we've also got a whole new ecosystem around employer recruitment practices. And increasingly they are demanding more of their college and university partners in supporting the recruitment of the best graduates from those institutions. And on top of all of that, if that's not enough for you, we also have a new and wide-ranging discussion around the future of credentials. Is it all about degrees? Is it all about non-credit? Is it all about certificates? Where's the traction going to be in the decade ahead? So I think those are three of the significant challenges that we face as we enter into this discussion. And I'm sure throughout the day we'll hear some meaningful responses to each of those. But I also wanted to highlight that some of our nearest and dearest friends here in New England are already taking action to experiment in these areas. And so I just wanted to highlight a few institutions from our neighborhood that are doing some interesting work. I would mention Bunker Hill Community College, which has over the past few years been partnering with MIT, and specifically with MIT-X, to deliver an introductory course in computer science through MIT's MOOC platform. And so this represents a different kind of collaboration among institutions. We also see something like Southern New Hampshire University, which is partnering with Flatiron, a coding boot camp for a 3+1 program, allowing students to get this coding experience, but then also a bachelor's degree, and at the same time partnering with Flatiron to bring their coding academy online. We see things like Merrimack College, which is partnering with Meteor Learning around competency-based education, largely delivered online. We also see, for example, Northeastern University, which has partnered with Burning Glass to really understand labor market demand as it takes its programs, its hybrid programs, into new markets around the country, including cities like Charlotte and Seattle and Silicon Valley, and more recently Toronto, Canada. And then we also see even an institution like Harvard Business School through HBX experimenting around online learning for non-traditional students, delivering its core program, which is a very low-cost collection of 3 courses focused on business fundamentals, which it is largely delivering to alumni and corporate partners. And then finally, I would also mention Bentley University here in the greater Boston area, which has, as many of you may know, the most highly ranked career services office in the country, according to Princeton Review. And despite being an applied professional institution, has recently been building its differentiation around the intermingling of the liberal arts and business education. So lots and lots of interesting work there out in the field, in our neighborhood, but still some of these key challenges that I think we need to continue to dialogue about.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. Paul, I'm sure you have a number of responses to what Peter has said, and I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about your global experiences in higher education institutions and work integrated learning. You were telling me before the session you just attended a 4-day session here. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you. And Peter, thank you for the remarks. And I'm helping your book Becoming Fast Selling because I've been promoting it at the institute that we just completed here in Boston at Wentworth Institute of Technology. We had institutions from 5 countries participating in this program. We had Peter's book as one of our resources. And these institutions were attending the institute to look at how to bring experiential education and in many instances cooperative education to their campuses. And universities from Malaysia and Thailand, Vietnam, as well as Canada and several other institutions from the United States. I'd like to respond briefly to a couple of the challenges that Peter mentioned, and then speak just for a couple of minutes about the future of the global experiential learning, some of WACE's opportunities that we have. I would certainly agree with the notion, Peter, of the complex ecosystem. And when we talk about effective, cooperative, and work-integrated education, we're really thinking from a holistic point of view that we want to make sure we are including the student, the employer, the university, certainly in many cases, government. Many countries, governments are very supportive of this initiative. And we try to think of the student in a holistic way, that it's not a student that we're preparing just for future employment, but enhancing their educational learning and thinking about all of the ways in which we can support that student with the knowledge and the soft skills, etc. The other thing is your other point about do we really understand work readiness and career preparation. I hadn't really looked at a definition of work readiness until you raised the point through our conversation. And I Googled it, and I saw it said it's really providing foundational skills to be minimally qualified. And one of the things that struck me was the word minimally. So I wasn't really too satisfied with that definition. But I think NACE, which I think many of you may know, the National Association of College and Employers, they have, I think, a really good definition of career readiness. And they talk about competencies, and they list 6 or 7, many of the ones that we talked about with communications and leadership. But they say these competencies to broadly prepare college graduates for the transition from college to work. And I think the idea of broadly preparing students, and certainly the importance of transition from college to the beginning of one's career is very, very important. The other just aspect I'd like to comment on, Phil, is a little bit about the future of our work, the future of experiential learning. And I am often asked the question within at least the United States, is experiential learning or cooperative education, internships, is it growing? And it's a difficult question to answer in the United States because we have so many different definitions. So if you say, is cooperative education growing? Well, it may depend on how an institution defines it. We certainly know in our country that experiential learning and internships and undergraduate research is growing rapidly across American higher education. In some other countries, I'll give an example of in Canada, they have a much more homogeneous definition of what cooperative education is. They have an accreditation system, they can measure it, they can count it, and they know that in fact that it's a growing pedagogical model in Canada. In terms of future growth, you had mentioned some of the institutions that are doing some very interesting things. Just wanted to mention a couple of models. Starting here in the U.S., WACE has been working with SUNY, the State University of New York, and Chancellor Nancy Zimpher, she's taken on this tremendous challenge of, when she began, it was to bring cooperative education to 500,000 students in the SUNY system. And we've been working with Nancy and her faculty and staff for 4 or 5 years, supporting her in this effort. They have shifted a bit, and they've decided to call it applied learning, which gets back to some maybe definitional issues. And I think, from my understanding, the faculty felt more comfortable thinking of bringing in applied learning opportunities across their 64 campuses, and now they're thinking of this as potentially a requirement for their graduation. 2 other examples, and then I'll stop. On a global basis, we've been working with the Minister of Education from Namibia, and she attended one of our world conferences, which was in Istanbul a few years ago. And she came to learn about the model of work integrated learning, and she was so impressed with it and so concerned about their unemployment in her country and some of the issues in higher education. She has worked with WACE over the past several years, and her vision is to bring work integrated learning to every single undergraduate student in Namibia. And because that is, posing lots of challenges, because there aren't as many workplaces for the students to go out and have this kind of experience. So we're looking at creating new models to support that initiative. And then finally, and I think this is maybe one of the most visionary challenges that WACE and my board and the faculty and staff that we work with globally, we have an office, we actually have an office here at University of Massachusetts Lowell, which is our secretariat, but we have 3 other offices around the world, one of which is in Bangkok. And the former Minister of Education of Thailand and president of 2 founding universities is working with us, and Professor Winchett, and his vision is to bring this model of education, not only to Thailand, which they're doing very, very well, but all throughout the 10 ASEAN nations. And so, for instance, having Vietnam here this weekend to learn about cooperative education fits within this vision of trying to really provide these experiences to students who, in many other instances, may not have the opportunity to learn outside the classroom. So there are many more global stories I could share, but I'll stop at this point and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Paul. Lynn, I'm hoping you'll respond to what Peter and Paul have said, and we'll speak a bit about the study that AAC&U is doing in terms of employer survey and economic trends, research that really aligns perfectly with the kind of issues that we're talking about. Can you share a little bit about what you've learned so far?
Sure. At AAC&U, our mission is to make liberal education and inclusive excellence the foundation for institutional purpose and educational practice. We have over 1,350 members ranging from two-year institutions, public, private, research institutions, HBCUs, online institutions. But what they have in common is their commitment to liberal education and to equity in higher education. We know that a major doesn't matter as much as the educational experience that students have while undergraduates. It's not enough to train people technically. What we hope for in a liberal education is to engender the capacity to write and speak and think with precision, coherence, and clarity, to be able to propose and construct and evaluate arguments and anticipate and respond to objections. But more importantly, to have the kind of moral or narrative imagination necessary to understand what it's like to be in the shoes of another different from oneself. In a world that is increasingly globally interdependent and where rapidly changing technology means rapid obsolescence, we're convinced that the best preparation that we can offer students is a liberal education that trains them to be adaptable and flexible in the face of change and to be innovators in their own lives, understanding that the jobs of the future have not yet been invented. So we wanted to work with employers to see whether they were looking for the kind of education that our member institutions were providing. We partnered with Hart Research Associates, and did a survey of employers. And what we found is that they really are looking for students to have the critical thinking skills that I've outlined, that they want our students to be able to work effectively in teams with people who are different from them. And then they want those skills of empathy. They want them to have that grit and to be able to have the patience to deal with problems for which we don't already have answers. Higher education has spent so much time presenting students with standardized tests, seeing if they can answer questions for which we already know the right responses. What we need to do is to train students to grapple with the most fundamental questions that are facing our global society and to be able to provide innovative solutions. The gap that we found between what students were reporting in these surveys and what employers were looking for is that students were much more convinced that they had the skills that the employers were looking for than the employers believed. And so we are involved in a project now that is looking at the valid assessment of learning in undergraduate education, the Value Initiative. And there was an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education today that talks about our partnership with SHIO, State Higher Education Executive Officers, and looking at the creation of portfolios through a multi-state collaborative with 13 states. And Maine, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island are involved in this project. We're looking at portfolios put together by students involving 900 faculty in this project to see whether students are able to apply and conceptualize, whether they are able to connect the experiential learning that they have
through internships with their curriculum. Because our goal is to make sure that students not only have internship experiences, work experiences, connect curriculum to career, but that they can reflect on those experiences in a way that will help them move to the next level when they get into the workforce. And so we're excited about this partnership, and we think that this is the future of assessment. A degree doesn't guarantee the quality of education. We want to take seriously calls for accountability in higher education. So in January, I did a piece for Inside Higher Ed on Marco Rubio's statement that we need more welders and fewer philosophers. And as a philosopher, whose father was a welder, I was particularly interested in but while I reject Rubio's claim, I think we need to take seriously the fears underlying this message, that education is too expensive, it's too difficult to access, and it doesn't teach people 21st century skills. We need to be able to demonstrate that we are indeed teaching students 21st century skills.
Thank you, Lee. I looked at the attendance list for this conference. Many of you represent the academic leadership of your institution. I'm sure almost all of you are interested in student success and graduation rates and 100% job placement. And you just brought up something very interesting, Lynn, and that is the notion of the value proposition that we hear about all the time. Many have said that higher education, in all its forms, will look very different 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now. How do you think experiential learning and work-integrated learning will be a part of that as we think about the value proposition of higher ed today? And I offer this to all three of our panelists. Lynn, could you respond to that?
I think it will be essential. We know from recent studies, the Gallup-Purdue study, showing that people in the workforce who are thriving, both personally and professionally, this kind of mindfulness approach to living, are those that have had high-impact practices, have been engaged in projects for a semester or more, who've been able to connect curriculum to career or engage with their professors outside of the classroom. We know that there's a disparately positive impact of these sorts of high-impact practices on students of color and on women. And so I think if we take seriously notions of equity, then every college and university needs to embed experiential learning into their curriculum in ways that will ensure that students will thrive upon graduation.
I certainly would agree, and I think that in many instances it's essential today and will continue to be. And I think in part it's being driven by students wanting to have these experiences, so when they graduate they feel and their parents feel that the students will be successful and will have a satisfying professional career. I also think that it is currently being driven and will continue to by the interests and needs of industry and preparing the future workforce. And as an example, on a global basis, in Japan, there's a more recent movement supported by the Ministry of Education to bring these kinds of experiences to Japanese students. They're very well academically prepared, but industry is saying, when you begin working with us, we don't feel you're prepared to contribute immediately. So there's a movement across that country, and I think that we'll see examples like this in many other countries around the world.
I would make two observations. One, I think that the role of place in education may change, and I think that the orientation of institutions of higher learning to their alumni will change, so that there's more of a genuinely lifelong learning relationship between institutions and their graduates. On the geography front, at a very, very simple level, a university is a place where students go to sit with faculty, experience a curriculum, and then earn a credential. But the opportunity now to disaggregate those different pieces of that value chain and experience them in different ways in different
settings creates a whole array of different methods for delivering education. And so one of the really interesting features of edX, I think in particular, insofar as MIT looks at it, is that all of this online learning, big data, MOOC-driven kind of educational provision for them is in some measure, and maybe even a large measure, about how to rethink the classroom experience, how to rethink the campus experience. And so the role of place, I think, is going to evolve. And in addition, not just how we use the campus, but how we take learning into the workplace and how we bring the workplace into the classroom as well. So about 5 years ago, Bud Peterson became president of the Georgia Institute of Technology, and he did something pretty unusual. He formed a committee to create a strategic plan for the university, and often strategic plans would have 5 years or 10 years or something in that range. And he said, we're going to create a 25-year strategic plan. And as part of that effort, he encouraged the campus community to consider a few different options. One where the future looked largely like the present, and one where the future looked quite different. And as they started anticipating what that different future might look like, it involved far shorter residency experiences. Maybe for a bachelor's degree, students only come to campus for 2 years. Maybe for a graduate degree, they don't come at all. But we have a relationship with our alumni where as they change jobs, as they change careers, as they change industries, they come back to us again and again and again in order to acquire the skills that they need to move on. Ultimately, that was a sort of more transformative future. I think that their plan actually landed somewhere between those two. But they are certainly one institution among others, and it's interesting that you do see schools like MIT and Georgia Tech and other technically oriented institutions trying to anticipate a different kind of future with different kinds of delivery models and different kinds of customers, undergraduate and graduate, and seeing the boundaries between those customers and the delivery sites work so that we have a more multifaceted approach to serving.
I just wanted to make an underscore point, Lynn, that you made about the liberal arts education. And I thought of a study that we did a number of years ago interviewing high school guidance counselors about their understanding of experiential learning and cooperative education. And their view at the time was those are fine programs, but they're really probably mostly just for engineers. And certainly this model wouldn't work in the liberal arts. And because that's not true at all, we've seen many successful stories. And Northeastern University is a great local one, where a very large number of liberal arts students complete cooperative education programs. And in some instances, I think that they even need this kind of experience more than some of the other professional. But it's a bias that had existed, or maybe a misunderstanding, and that's something that our organization really tries to promote, that these kinds of experiences should be for all students and not limited to business students or engineering students, etc.
Well, it's apparent that our panelists all agree with Aristotle. That's encouraging. We're right on schedule, and we would be delighted to take questions from the audience. Can I invite someone up to ask a question? Sir.
Thank you. As you can tell by my accent, I'm Canadian, so thank you, Paul, for explaining what we're doing in Canada. There's a lot that I actually would love to talk about. The first is what you were talking about with a lot of it's going to be student-generated. In fact, in Canada, we had one of our biggest institutions, all the students came together and had a referendum and said, would you, as a student, want a $3 increase to your tuition in order for us to have our own co-op career center that was updating with the times? Yes, it happened, and now we have a bunch of schools that are taking, one of the first things that they did was they implemented Brightman. And they had, now we have a bunch of schools that have done the exact same thing. The skills gap that you're talking about, and all three of you mentioned the broad terms, the critical thinking, the group work, the communication skills. We've been talking about that for 20 years, and the skills gap has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. The organizations, and we're over 5,000 organizations in this area on Ripen. They're not looking necessarily for those, right? We're talking about marketing students. The companies say it's really, really great. The students have this business acumen, but they don't have the skills that are needed today. They don't know how to A/B test. They don't know how to use data modeling for drip marketing campaigns. They've never used Unbounce. They've never used Salesforce. So all of these things that are new that they need to know, we're not teaching them, but we are concentrating on critical thinking and group work. And so I'd like to hear your opinions on how we mesh that, how we bring those together.
Well, I can start with you. I do think that, in general, we could summarize much of this conversation by saying that the boundaries are shifting. And again, the boundary of the campus, the boundary of the learner, the boundary of the ecosystem around the provision of education. And I do think that one of the boundaries that we have to be considerate about is the boundary around curriculum and who owns the curriculum and who's developing the curriculum. And there are cases where employers are brought in to guide the design of curriculum or, let's say, inform the design of curriculum. There are other cases where perhaps there may be a feeling that employers are driving too much the shape of curriculum. And the risk there is that, as has already been observed, industries come and go, companies come and go, jobs come and go. We have to think about education as not just being training or preparation or education for that first job, but ideally teach the adaptability to build a career and ultimately to your last job. And we have to think about our collaboration with the economy and the immediate job needs of the economy in careful ways so that we don't prepare a curriculum, which takes years to develop, for the needs of today and forget about the needs of tomorrow that we haven't yet anticipated. So having experience with Salesforce, for example, would be a great thing if a student had the opportunity to do that in the context of an internship. Whether we should be teaching Salesforce in the classroom, I think is another kind of question. I'm not sure that the answer is no, but I do think it's a different kind of question. So I think we have to balance fundamental skills, broad skills that have broad applicability with more narrow and deep. I think we have seen, for 2 decades, things like the Tuck Bridge program at Dartmouth, where you have business education for liberal arts students. Middlebury has a similar program. Other schools do as well. Increasingly now, we're starting to see liberal arts boot camps for engineering students. Right? So that's another way in which we need to think about the boundaries shifting a little bit. So, I think increasingly we have to get out of this either-or mode of thinking, which is convenient, but instead do the hard work of both and figuring out the right proportions of each.
Paul?
I think we need to interrogate the structures that we have within the academy that create barriers. For too long, departments have replicated themselves, and the way that we provide rewards is to give tenure based on peer-reviewed journal articles that perhaps 6 people will read, instead of looking at the kind of intensive hands-on work that this will require. We'll never bridge that gap unless we start recognizing and rewarding the value of this type of integrative experiential learning. Faculty have a lot to do. They need to keep up with the research. They need to prepare for a class. And they are members of disciplinary societies. So all of that requires time. We have to recognize the value of this type of teaching in tenure and promotion and engage in professional development for contingent faculty who haven't been given the resources necessary when they are the ones often who are teaching most of these types of courses.
And I'd say maybe we can chat later, so we won't take too much time. Good luck to the Toronto Blue Jays, and maybe we should take another question.
Don't say that to us.
Given that the Red Sox aren't playing, we did for the Jays.
Sir?
So I don't want to be the skunk at the picnic here, but I come mostly from a private sector corporate background, and I'll say at the outset, I've worked in several industries, and I know industry verticals can be different, but IT, software, defense. I have hired over the course of my corporate career hundreds and hundreds of co-ops, either to work for me directly or as part of gaining really good engineers. And Northeastern was one of the examples of a place that we did really well. However, I would say that I never hear a discussion about talking to the private sector about how you're putting these co-ops to work, how much thought has been given to it, whether there's really a plan. My own experience was an ad hoc mess is the best I can. Now, maybe things have changed, but in general, we ran around in circles, brought in some co-ops, moved them around, had them do work. I would say over the last 10 or 15 years, the private sector, I would call it having a 90-day business strategy for the next earnings per share, is even less and less willing to do these sort of things. Where is the collaboration on the education side to say we really need to sit down and talk about those jobs, forecast them, and do it? I just think the whole thing is just a mishmash. And I'm critical of the private sector, but I think the education side needs to think about the conversation.
I will begin, and I would agree that if there isn't a collaboration, a discussion, it just leads to low-level, poor quality. We look at attributes of really high-quality experiential learning, and there are 3 or 4. And one of the key ones that we talk about is preparation, both on the side of the university and with the employer. So when the student is getting ready to leave the university or entering the first or second co-op, both the industry and the university are prepared. So on day one, the student enters a quality kind of experience. And I would agree, it certainly doesn't happen in all cases, but we really try to promote that this is a critical element to high-quality experiential education. And if it doesn't occur, students will come back to the campus and will say, I just really wasted 3 months, or I didn't learn very much through that experience.
Even very traditional liberal arts colleges are starting to have in their career development centers employer relations designees who really are focused on making sure that the experience is meaningful. And the companies themselves are eager to make this work, and because it's a big investment of their time and resources as well. And so we are seeing a recognition that we have to pay attention to this if we're going to provide a quality experience for our students.
And I mean, I can offer my own perspective from my time at Northeastern. So Northeastern's been doing co-op for 110 years. And I think for many, many decades, the model was earn to learn. It wasn't really integrated at all. It was really just an opportunity to stop out, make some money, come back, and move forward. And then, in the 70s and 80s, I think there was a more concerted effort to integrate the two, and that's when Northeastern really became, involved with waste. And I think more recently, we're now in a third phase where I think Northeastern and many other providers of co-op are really trying to think about the design in ways that are much more integrated and that bring the job-specific skills into the design of the program. When a student goes off the co-op, it's not just going off the co-op, right? There are courses that they take before co-op. There are courses that they take after co-op that are meant to generate that reflection. But I think you're absolutely right to say that there's more that we can do to engineer a more effective system. And that we have, we've done a fair bit of good work sort of by the seat of our pants. But I think this whole conversation suggests we need to take this more seriously, and we need to design it in a more effective and efficient fashion.
One thing I would add, Peter, is that it's part of the integration is, and this is a model that Drexel University uses and many others in the United States, the mapping of learning outcomes from learning outcomes of the classroom and what's expected at the work site. And really, an integrated, high-quality program looks at those learning outcomes, and they eventually bring those together to make sure that the student is really achieving, and there's an assessment of those outcomes. So I think that's part of working together and being, more collaborative.
Hi, thanks. I'm Paula Krebs, Bridgewater State University. And as an academic administrator, I really want to return to Lynn's point about the importance of curriculum and faculty and changing faculty structures if this is really going to change on a campus. Not only tenure promotion standards to include this kind of faculty on the part of faculty, but further back than that in graduate school preparation, because faculty members are entering positions with no sense of the importance of any of this. That you talk about focusing on research only, that's all you're trained in. So I wonder if any of you have good models for, can reference some good models for ways that faculty and employers work together to shape curricula at institutions, especially in the humanities, for example, where it's not such a natural connection, and I have a much harder sell with humanities faculty than I do, say, with social sciences faculty about incorporating career readiness into curriculum. Do we have any good models?
So the American Historical Association is working with Council of Graduate Schools and Lumina Foundation and NEH to develop curricula. So we had a meeting a few weeks ago in Virginia to look at graduate programs that would train not only people for the professoriate, but those 5/6 of graduate students who will not be going into academia because they're not
Right.
And so we talked about the movement away from preparing future faculty, the fact that we often reward the students who are deemed the best graduate students by not having them teach. And so by the time they enter the classroom, they are at a real disadvantage with an increasingly diverse student population. So there are some initiatives out there that are looking at this issue and providing some resources. We do this through our networking conferences around integrative learning and high-impact practices, general education. So we'll keep you posted on what's emerging.
I would add that WACE as well, 3 or 4 times a year, provides symposia or institutes specifically designed for faculty to help them understand more about this pedagogical model or understand about assessing learning outcomes. We have a research symposium on experiential education. So part of our mission, and it's because we certainly agree with your point, that faculty are not trained. They come into institutions that may value this, but they've had no training previously. And so that's part of our mission, is to help faculty, not only in the U.S., but globally, understand more about this field.
In my experience, much of the relationship with the local economy happens at the faculty level. And you do, as I said, you do increasingly see corporate relations functions or external relations functions that are no longer in the advancement office, but really trying to have a broader impact. Nevertheless, a lot of that work really happens at the faculty level, and some schools it's in the business school, and others it's in law, and some it's in communications. There are best practices in almost every institution out there. They're just hidden. And it's amazing how rarely colleges or universities take the opportunity to learn what their most experienced faculty are doing in that domain and share it with others. And so that, to me, is an opportunity, is to find those, high-performing instances on campus and to then create a venue on campus where folks can have a dialogue about that.
We've really come to the end of the session. We have time perhaps for one more question.
Hello, I'm Leo Wong from Greenfield Community College. And I'm also a dean of humanities like Paula. And one of the things that we're seeing on a national scale is a flurry of initiatives that are really focused on short periods of time, real technical skill based, but we did a similar survey to what the AAC and we did, and we found very similar answers in our region, where employers are really focused on the kinds of skills that are built up over time. Good communication skills, good writing skills, working with others, and particularly with community colleges where we're dealing with students who have not had the advantages of sometimes not as strong public school education or been out of education for periods of time. These are not things that can be done in 30 credits. You know, these are skills that really need to be seen as a lifelong process of learning. And I'm wondering about, you know, your own backgrounds, my background is also not directly connected to my profession. So as an English professor or philosophy and then going on, I believe those kinds of educational experiences gave you the skills to be successful. And I worry that we're shortchanging our students when we focus so much on the technical. And how do we broaden that discussion in the U.S.?
Well, and your points are really important, and your president, President Pure, just gave a talk to the National Academies. I'm on a commission that is looking at whether the arts and humanities have an impact on STEM with 2 M's, and the ways in which the lives of physicians are enriched through humanities and arts education, the kind of training that we need to give students to make sure that they're not thinking in isolation. The problems that we see in the world are not divided according to disciplinary endeavors. And so the complexity of the challenges we're facing require this type of integrative thinking. And the whole purpose of this commission is to make the case for higher education that this integrative learning really matters and is more important than ever. And in part, it's for legislators who are defunding programs in the arts and the humanities, thinking that STEM is the silver bullet. And so we need to really investigate the true costs of a world in which everything is reduced to scientism. Not all knowledge can be derived on the basis of empirical observation. There are phenomenological experiences that allow us to flourish fully as human beings.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, Lynn, Paul, for your insights. We thank you, the audience, for being here. We hope this conversation and dialogue advances and illuminates this important, increasingly important topic. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for that.